Hi, I'm Piyush, and today we are going to solve a lead code medium problem that's not only interesting but it's quite fun, especially if you love chess. The problem is quite simple. You're given a chessboard with infinite number of cells along with the starting coordinate of a knight and the target coordinate the knight has to reach to. The problem is you need to figure out the minimum possible jumps the knight has to make to reach the target cell. So let's get started. Now before we jump into the solution, let's first understand how we can model the chessboard. Since the board is infinite, we can start by visualizing a small snapshot of it. Let's say the knight is now positioned at a cell 0, 0 as mentioned in the problem. In that case, we can represent all its neighboring cells as well using coordinate pairs with some fixed rules. That is, if we move up or down from this cell, we increase and decrease the row number accordingly, and if we move left and right, we increase and decrease the column number accordingly. Now this will help us identify each cell with a coordinate and will also help us create a graph for the knight to traverse later. Now using this strategy, we can represent the knight's adjacent cells using coordinate pairs that reflects how the knight moves, specifically changes in rows and column values. As you might already know, a knight in a chessboard can move to 8 cells as shown over here. If you observe, a knight jump has 2 steps in one direction and then 1 step in a perpendicular direction. So given the starting coordinate of the knight as 0, 0, the knight can move to 8 possible cells identified by 2, 1 to 1, 2. Now this particular problem will actually be a building block for a dynamic programming problem that we'll solve later in the next video. So how do we solve this problem first? Now let's first take a small example on a bounded chessboard of size 5 x 5. We know that the chessboard cells can be represented using a xy coordinate as we discussed, and we can create a graph where each node is a cell in the board and each edge represents a valid knight jump to a neighboring cell. We won't be constructing the entire graph up front. Instead, we will be building it on the fly as the knight moves around the board. If the knight is currently at 0, 0, we compute its next valid moves by checking all 8 possible knight jumps, but only consider those that stay within the board boundaries. From this starting position, let's say the knight can move to 4 valid cells. Suppose the knight chooses to jump on 2, -1. From there, it can again jump to 8 possible positions, one of which happens to be the target cells. In this example, the knight reaches the target cell in 2 jumps, which also happens to be the minimum number of moves needed to reach the solution. Now that we have established how the graph is constructed on the fly, let's talk about how we can actually move the knight around. As discussed earlier, a knight has 8 possible moves. To handle these moves efficiently, we'll use direction vectors, which define how much the knight should change its row and column for each particular move. We'll create 2 arrays, one for the row deltas and one for the column deltas, each containing 8 values representing the knight's unique L-shaped jumps. To compute the knight's next position, we simply add the corresponding row and column deltas to its current coordinates. For example, if the knight is currently at 0, 0, applying the first pair of deltas will move it to 2, 1, a valid knight move, right? Well, that gives us a way to construct the graph dynamically during runtime and also helps us simulate the knight's possible movements as and when required. But how do we find the shortest path to the destination node? To answer this, let's first break down the knight jumps across the board and then we'll catch up from there. So we start with 0, 0. From there, the knight can jump to 8 possible positions like 2, 1, 1, 2, and so on. On the second jump, it can reach another set of positions, and this continues until we reach the target cell. Now some positions might repeat, and we definitely don't want to visit the same cell multiple times. So we maintain a visited set to keep track of cells the knight has already reached. Cool. If you think about it, we are essentially building an N-ary tree where each node is identified by its cell coordinate and each node has at most 8 adjacent nodes in the next level. Here, the key observation is that the level of the node determines the number of jumps the knight took to reach that particular node. And following this pattern, if we find the target node at level n, it means that it took n jumps to reach this cell. So if you remember from the graphs in action video about breadth first search, we mentioned that BFS or breadth first search can help us find the shortest path in an unweighted graph. Just to recap, BFS explores the graph level by level using a queue, which means that the first time we visit a cell, we have already taken the minimum number of steps to reach it. For example, over here, the shortest path identified as the path from 0, 0 to the target node at level n. So the main intuition here is that we do a breadth first search from 0, 0 or the starting coordinate of the knight, and we keep track of the level for each cell or the number of jumps it took to reach that cell. And once we find the target node, we simply return the current level, which denotes the minimum knight moves to reach the target node. Note that we actually reduced the given problem to a search problem and then we solved it using breadth first search. Now from an implementation point of view, the breadth first search queue will store not just the coordinates of each cell, but also the level, which represents the number of jumps or moves made so far. We start by initializing the queue with the starting cell, that is 0, 0 at level 0. Then for each of the 8 valid knight moves from the current cell, we compute the next positions and push them into the queue, with the level as current level plus 1, which in this case becomes 1. Now we keep on repeating this process, exploring level by level until we finally reach the target node, at which point we simply return the minimum number of moves required to get there. Well, now we are ready to jump to the implementation to see how it all fits together. Alright, so first I'm going to define a position type, and it's just a pair of integers, row and column. This will make the code look a bit cleaner when we start using BFS. Now I will also define 2 direction vectors that we talked about, knight row move and knight column move, and each pair of the corresponding elements represents one pair of knight's 8 possible moves, as we discussed. Well, now let's write down a small helper function, isValidPosition, which simply checks whether a knight's position in the board is within the bounds. Notice that I am allowing a row column pair to go from -300 to 300 as specified in the problem. Well, now let's get into the heart of the solution, the BFS function. So we define the function, and let us first set up a queue and a visited array. We define the space of the visited array as 604 cross 604. Since the given chessboard goes from -300 to 300, both rows and columns, and we need space for 601 values in each x and y axis, and we added a little padding as well. So let's initialize this visited array first, and then we add the starting knight's position into the queue, and we mark it visited with 0 moves. Notice how I'm adding 300 to the index? Well, that's because our board includes negative coordinates as well. So shifting it makes it 0 indexed properly. Now inside the BFS loop, we first pop the current position from the queue and get the distance, and we try out all the 8 knight moves. Now if the move is a valid move and the cell hasn't been visited yet, we check if we have reached the target cell and written the distance itself. Otherwise, we mark the position visited and push it to the queue for further exploration. Finally, we end this function and return 0 in case the target doesn't exist, or if it's just same as the source. Lastly, from the minimum knight moves function, we call the BFS method with the knight's starting position as 0, 0 and the target as x, y. Now let's submit the code, and it's accepted. And that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you loved this video, and if you did, do share it with your friends and do like and subscribe to my channel as well. Also be sure to check out trilab.io's problem set in order to find more such problems along with the solutions in multiple languages, and there are some other interesting content there as well. So do check it out and see you in the next video. Stay curious, stay happy, bye.